It's a celebration of America's freedom. Welcome to the Mark Scaringi Show. The Mark Scaringi Show is your place for a weekly discussion on making America great again. The important political and legal issues of the day, a celebration of the Constitution, and traditional American values. Mark is a practicing attorney, a former senatorial candidate, a Donald J. Trump-endorsed delegate, and a defender of the Constitution. His goal? To put America first. And now, celebrating America's freedoms, here's attorney Mark Scaringi.
Well, good afternoon and welcome to the Mark Scaringi Show. This is your place on the dial for constitutional conservatism. This is where we talk about the important political and legal issues of the day from the perspective of putting America first. And thank you for tuning in on WHP 580 and iHeartRadio. You can download the iHeartRadio app and you can listen to this show from anywhere around the world. And thanks for watching us on Harrisburg 100 Facebook Live. You can comment live, and we'll read your comments on the air. You can call in 717-540-0580. For prior podcasts of the show, for my columns on Penn Live and the Harrisburg Patriot News, or to check out some great merchandise, take a look at the markscaringshow.com website. Well, this week, Democratic presidential candidates headed to the altar of white guilt in New York. There, waiting for them at the altar, was the holiest of holy reverends, Al Sharpton. Sharpton is, of course, a notorious race hustler and anti-Semite who has been a central figure in causing real racial strife in America, from the Tawana Brawley racist rape hoax to the George Zimmerman racist assault hoax. Sharpton has stoked riots in Crown Heights, resulting in the mob killing of a Jewish student, and another riot that resulted in shootings and the burning of Freddie's Fashion Mart, in which 7 people were burned alive, all in the name of a fake white and Jewish racism in America. Now, instead of spending the rest of his life in jail, Reverend Al Sharpton has become a prime-time television talk show host on MSNBC. He's a close friend and an associate of former President Barack Obama, and he is considered one of the kingmakers in the Democratic presidential primaries. And that's why Democratic presidential candidates have flocked to his annual National Action Network conference in honor of Martin Luther King Jr., an actual and real civil rights hero. The Democrats are there to kiss the ring of the Holy Reverend Al Sharpton. Now, Sharpton, through his National Action Network, is promoting the reparations issue, in which U.S. taxpayers will be forced by our government to pay money to black Americans because America many years ago once enslaved Africans. Now, this is a preposterous proposition that is on par with Sharpton's history of shaking down corporate America with false claims of racism. Americans living today have nothing to do with slavery in America a long, long time ago. Nevertheless, major Democratic presidential candidates, from the former Congressman and fake Hispanic Robert Francis O'Rourke, who goes by the nickname Beto, to U.S. Senator Kamala Harris, to U.S. Senator and fake Cherokee Indian Elizabeth Warren, are all in on the reparations scam. Now, the bill they all declared their support for at Reverend Sharpton's National Action Network conference. This bill is sponsored by Representative Sheila Jackson Lee, a Democrat from Texas, and it would make recommendations concerning any form of apology and compensation to begin the long-delayed process of atonement for slavery. Now, as in a quick side, notice she includes the word compensation, so that's going to mean that's the reparations or the cash. And as an aside, I wonder if there is a conflict of interest for a black Congresswoman, Sheila Jackson Lee, and black politicians voting on a bill to compensate black Americans who are descendants of African slaves in America. That's just a little aside. Maybe someone will check in on the conflict of interest angle in this reparations bill. Now, Julian Castro, who is an extremely proud Hispanic, who himself admitted that he got into Stanford because of affirmative action and is the most supportive candidate for reparations among the 2020 Democratic presidential candidates, he said earlier this week, while addressing Sharpton's National Action Network, he said the United States will never truly heal until we address the original sin of slavery. If, under our Constitution, we compensate people if we take their property, why wouldn't we compensate people who were considered property and sanctioned by the state? Now, on the other hand, I assume Castro is not aware of the irony of this statement. The Constitution, as we know, does prohibit the government from taking the private property of Americans without public need and just compensation. So, taking Castro's reasoning and applying it to actual constitutional law, U.S. taxpayers would be required to pay the descendants of slave owners to compensate them for the government's taking of their property when the United States government freed the slaves. That's just another little aside, a little bit of irony in Julian Castro's statement about the need for current U.S. taxpayers to pay reparations to the descendants of slaves in America. Yeah, I'm sure the actual understanding of the Constitution and constitutional law is somewhat lost on Julian Castro, as he is positioning himself to be the most pro-reparations candidate in an extremely left-wing Democratic presidential primary election that we see developing right before our eyes. Now, Elizabeth Warren, the United States Senator, Elizabeth Warren, the self-proclaimed descendant of Cherokee Indians, she stated that Sharpton's National Action Network, we must confront the dark history of slavery and government-sanctioned discrimination in this country that has had many consequences, including undermining the ability of black families to build wealth in America for generations. Now, my response, I thought we had already confronted the dark history of slavery when we fought the Civil War to end slavery and free the slaves. So Julian Castro wants us to atone, or that was Representative Sheila Jackson Lee. I think we have atoned for slavery, haven't we? Over 600,000 Americans lost their lives in the U.S. Civil War, hundreds of thousands of them fighting for the North to free the slaves. But these historical facts do not appear in any of the statements made by the Democratic presidential candidates. Now, Socialist Bernie Sanders, who is once again running for president, he was previously rather dismissive of this idea of reparations, but now, as he's looking back at the lackluster support he received from the black community in America in his last presidential run, he wants to position himself a little bit better to attract the black vote, which is a very important voting constituency in the Democratic Party, particularly in the primary. So now Bernie Sanders, our beloved socialist senator from Vermont, is now in support of the reparations bill. And the current it girl of the Democratic Party, Ms. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, congresswoman from New York, she appeared at Sharpton's event, and she used a version of Hillary Clinton's black accent, her fake black accent, in which she declared that her Green New Deal will consider reparations to black Americans for slavery. Well, in any event, what do my listeners think? Should U.S. taxpayers compensate the descendants of slaves in America? Call in 717-540-0580. That's 717-540-0580. I want to know what you have to think about this important political topic. Now, stay tuned. We're going to take a brief commercial break. We'll be back right after this.
Now, more of Mark Scaringi on News Radio WHP 580.
And welcome back to the Mark Scaringi Show, your place on the dial for constitutional conservatism. We're talking about the important political and legal issue of the day at the Democratic presidential candidates for the 2020 presidential primary election flocked to New York today, over the past week, to meet with the Reverend Al Sharpton and his organization. And one of the key takeaways from that conference is that when each candidate got to the podium and gave their 5-minute talk about their campaign, they were then subjected to some questions from Mr. Sharpton. Mr. Sharpton was keen to find out whether the Democratic presidential candidates would support Sheila Jackson Lee's, the Democratic Congresswoman from Texas, her reparations bill to set up a commission to discuss ways to compensate Black Americans who are descendants of slaves, to provide some sort of financial compensation to them for the fact that they are related rather distantly to individuals who were enslaved here in America. All of the major Democratic presidential candidates came out strongly in favor of the reparations bill, and we're posing the question to our listeners whether they think it's a good idea, or do they support the reparations idea or the program of using U.S. taxpayer dollars to compensate Black Americans who are descendants of African slaves here in America. Now, interestingly, I wonder if those in favor of the reparations understand that a whole lot of Black Americans are taxpayers, and that if a reparations program is instituted, Black American taxpayers will be forced to pay reparations just like white American taxpayers. Yet Black Americans, under the argument of the reparations supporters, were victims of racism. However, if they're paying taxes, they're going to be paying taxes into this racist enslaved reparations program, unless there's going to be some sort of carve-out, an exemption for Black American taxpayers so that they don't have to pay the taxes that would be used to compensate the descendants of African slaves. That's going to be a pretty tough nut to crack for the IRS to figure that out. And I imagine we'll have a whole lot of Americans who are suddenly Black when they're filling out their income tax returns, kind of in the same way that Elizabeth Warren, a very white woman, all of a sudden became Cherokee Indian when she was applying to get into college and law school and to become a professor of law. Let's open up the phone bank, and we'll take some questions and comments. You can call in 717-540-0580. So we have John from York. Do you support the Democrats' reparations bill?
Well, if you give me a moment here, I'll try to answer that.
Sure.
A couple weeks ago, you asked me a good question that I've been thinking about ever since. And you said, what's the best way to eliminate racism in our nation and world, for that matter? And I said, of course, which is true, through Jesus Christ and transform lives through him. And that's certainly the main way. But I think if we support good civil rights organizations like the NAACP, the National Urban League, if we give them our support, I don't know if it would be actively or prayerfully or financially, however, that would be one big way to eliminate racism. And also, if we teach our children that everybody is one family under God, we're all brothers and sisters, we teach people love, respect, honor, tolerance. We teach people Dr. Martin Luther King's ideas. And I'm glad you complimented him a while ago. He's the greatest. He's the greatest. I don't think any amount of reparations could make up for something as horrible as slavery. And I don't think any amount of reparations could make up for something as horrible as taking the land away from the Native Americans. I mean, we have to treat people fairly now and make sure we're working for equal opportunity now for everyone, and love everybody as our brothers and sisters, as I said. I don't want to repeat myself.
Well,
go ahead.
A couple of things, John. The NAACP, the Urban League, of course, they receive massive taxpayer subsidies from the United States taxpayers already, and have.
Oh, do they?
Yeah. Well, sure. And but the issue is, do you support the reparations plan itself? They want to set up a commission, and they want to look into how they can provide financial compensation to Black Americans today who are descendants of African slaves. So do you support that plan?
Well, any way we can help, African Americans and Native Americans and people who are still victims of racism in a lot of ways, any way we can help them is fine. But I just don't see how any amount of money could make up for those evil things. I think the main thing we can do is to treat everybody with equity, treat everybody with fairness, recognize everybody as God's children.
Yes, of course. Of course, we must do all of those things. But so you are in favor of cash payments. You're just saying that there's not enough money we can give to Black Americans.
Well, yeah, there wouldn't be enough. I mean, I might be in favor of that. But the main thing is that we treat people fairly and
Right.
work
Oh, yeah,
for
we've got that. We've got the treating of
civil
people.
rights. Civil rights,
W-
yeah, and really support civil rights legislation and civil rights organizations.
Oh yeah, we're all for that. We've got all of that stuff, and we're working for
Yeah,
that, and that's wonderful. But when we're paying, when we're taking taxpayer dollars from the
yeah, I see what
American
you
people,
mean. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, do we take them from only white Americans, or do we take them from black Americans too, to collect the money
Well,
that
this
we'd
was
use to pay the reparations?
yeah, that would be real tough questions.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? That's tough questions, and I'm not sure. That's hard to answer.
Yeah, yeah, it is. Like, for example, Barack Obama is half black and half white. He pays taxes. He pays a lot of taxes because he's gotten incredibly wealthy because of his years of public service, being a public servant. He's a multimillionaire now. But
Hmm.
would he have to pay into the reparations pot, being that he's only half white?
Boy, that's a good question.
Or does he get a 50% discount?
Well, that's a real good question. I'm not sure I can answer that.
All right, John from York, thanks for calling. Appreciate the call.
Well, thank you. Sure.
Wayne from Lewisberry, you're on the Mark Scaringi Show. Do you support the Democrats' plan to provide financial compensation to black Americans who are descendants of slaves?
I think I do, at least partly. I think that every former slaveholder should pay any former slave a sizable part of his income and or what he earns at this point.
Well, we don't have any former slave owners still living today. They've been dead for 150 some years. So,
Jeez.
so
How
we,
about, do I get anything because my relatives died fighting for the North in the Civil War?
well, you raise a good question. Over 300,000 Americans, overwhelmingly white, fought in the Union Army in the Civil War to, among other things, free the slaves, and they accomplished their goal. So is that enough atonement? Is that enough blood having been spilled?
I really don't know. And you brought up Barack Obama. The African half of him didn't appear in the United States till well after the Civil War, so he has no quote-unquote slave blood in him. Michelle does.
Okay, well that's
Barack does not.
yeah, that's a great point. What about the millions of immigrants who have come to this country from Africa after the Civil War, after slavery was abolished? So they did not experience slavery. Are they entitled to reparations solely because they are black?
That's a very good question.
Yeah. Well,
It's gonna take a bigger mind than me to figure out.
yeah. Wayne from Lewisberry, thanks for calling. I appreciate
Thank you.
that. We have Peter from Dillsburg. You're on the Mark Scaringi Show. Do you support the Democrats' plan to provide financial compensation to black Americans who are descendants of slaves?
That would be a definite no.
And why is that?
You've already pointed out a bunch of them. What do you do with people that are Milano, which is half black, half white? What do you do with the people that got here who are black that got here after the Civil War? Right now, we do supply a lot of free college to black African Americans. A lot of them get breaks. Also, with American Indians, get a very good break on college education. So we try as a nation to heal the wounds, but with people like Al Sharpton around, those wounds never heal.
Well, you raised the point of affirmative action, and that was a federal government sponsored program that was specifically designed to give a leg up to those groups in our country who historically have been minorities and who have suffered some various forms of discrimination. So we have had affirmative action for many decades now.
Well, and that's even going overboard. I mean, if you look at the NFL or the NBA, 85% of those players are black. But you don't hear white people complaining and saying, "Hey, where's all the white kids playing football or basketball?"
Well, and
we don't do that. We don't stand up and yell those things.
And they're incredibly wealthy too. So I wonder if their taxpayer dollars will go into the pot that's used then to kind of recycle and then go back into to the pockets of black Americans who can prove they were descendants of slavery. So that's kind of an ironic part of this reparations plan. I think Democrats are probably going to have to exempt black taxpayers from paying
Well,
into the reparations. Otherwise, it wouldn't really make any sense.
It's just typical of a lot of, I want to heal everybody. When you try to heal everybody, you heal nobody.
Yeah.
There's no such thing as heal, everybody. You try to do the best you can at the moment you're in.
Amen.
I wasn't around. There was a lot of slavery that went on with Irish or Scottish people, especially in the Virgin Islands or the islands area.
Well,
because the work wasn't as hard as it was for picking cotton. So,
we
screaming for reparations for that.
That's true. We had indentured servitude in the United States for quite a long time from our founding era onward. That's a form of slavery, I would think. It was abolished by the 13th Amendment along with the abolition of slavery. So do we have to compensate poor Irish, poor Welsh, poor Scottish, and others who came to the U.S. as indentured servants? Peter from Dillsburg, thanks for calling. I've got to take a hard break. Thanks for listening to the Mark Scaringi Show. Stay tuned. We'll be back right after this.
Let's get back to the Mark Scaringi Show on News Radio WHP 580.
And welcome back to the Mark Scaringi Show, your place on the dial for constitutional conservatism. This is the place where we talk about the important political and legal issues of the day from the perspective of putting America first. We're talking about Democratic presidential 2020 candidates, Kamala Harris, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Julian Castro, and Bernie Sanders, and Beto, the Irish American Texan who claims to be Hispanic, went to the holiest of holy Reverend Al Sharpton to his National Action Network conference, and they all kissed his ring and pledged their support for the reparations bill proposed by Representative Sheila Jackson Lee, Democrat of Texas, to establish a commission and look into ways that we can compensate black Americans who are descendants of slaves, financial compensation, cash payments, there we are. And we're talking about whether or not our listeners here at WHP 580 and iHeartRadio and Harrisburg 100 Facebook, if they support the Democratic proposal to pay reparations. And some of our listeners have raised some great points, and we've got lots of callers on the phone banks. And interestingly, we have three mics, a mic from Harrisburg, a mic from Carlisle, and a mic from Camp Hill. So just hold on, mics, plural, for a minute or just for a minute. And I want to just make one other point, then we'll take your calls. And that is, what about all of those beautiful and amazing immigrants? And remember, my God, I love the immigrants. There's no question about that. And I always say that caveat whenever we talk about immigration. I love immigrants. But all of these amazing and beautiful immigrants we have in America, they came to America from nations around the world long after slavery was abolished here in the United States back in 1865. The immigrants had absolutely nothing to do with slavery, yet they will be forced to pay reparations. How many of my listeners are immigrants themselves or descendants of immigrants who came to America after 1865? Well, you'll have to pay the reparations tax too, even though you and your descendants had nothing to do with slavery in America. On my father's side, the Italian side, my great-grandparents came from Italy in the 1880s and 1890s. Long after slavery was abolished in America, they were extremely poor, white. I don't know, are Italians white? I'm not quite sure, but they were poor Italians who came to America, went to Pittsburgh because that's where the jobs were, and they were very, very poor. They did not own slaves, nor did they own indentured servants, and I'm a descendant from them. So I'm going to have to pay. There's no question, whatever reparations bill is passed, I will be paying the reparations tax. I'm dead certain of that. I pay every tax there is. And so I'll be paying a reparations tax, even though I'm descendant from Italians who came to America several decades after slavery was abolished and thus did not and could not own slaves. On my mother's side, they're German, English, Welsh. They were in the highlands of the Appalachian Mountains south of Pittsburgh and in Pittsburgh. for a couple of hundred years, but they never owned slaves, and slavery was abolished in Pennsylvania a long time before the American Civil War. So I have no history of being a slave owner on either side of my family, yet I'm going to have to pay a reparations tax to atone for my sins. I guess I am a sinner. There's no question about that. We all have sin. We all have original sin, but I never owned slaves. That's not one of my sins. I have others, but slavery and slave ownership is not one of them. Yet, rest assured, I will be paying this reparations tax. So let's open up the phone lines. I want to hear what my listeners think. Do you support the Democrat bill by Representative Sheila Jackson Lee that's gaining wide support from all of the major Democratic presidential candidates for 2020? So it's going to be an issue. Do you support the reparations bill? We'll take all these mics in a row. Mike from Harrisburg, you're on the Mark Scaringi Show.
Hi. No, I did not support it. I think if it happened in today's society, with how farther we've come along, of all races, it would be a totally different story. If you look throughout history, whites have been persecuted. Whites have been enslaved by different races. So, we entitled to that, to our compensation too. What it comes down to is not a matter of color; it's a matter of power. I think when people fear you and stuff like that, you'll do whatever. And then when you look at blacks, I'm a white guy. I'm not going to speak for a black person or tell you how I think they feel. But I mean, in all honesty, we should ask them where they would rather live at. And if they are not happy here and they would rather go back to where they were taken from, unlawfully or whatever, then we should give them money to go back there and find their heritage, find their family, absolutely. But you can't have your cake and eat it too. Every race has racist people in it, whites, blacks, Puerto Ricans, but it just seems that the white man is the guy that's the racist. We're the privileged person. I'm not privileged at all. I used to go around when I was 10 years old up in Altoona, knocking on doors, cutting grass, shoveling snow in the summertime, in the wintertime. My dad was getting laid off from work all the time. That's the way I grew up. I wasn't privileged.
So you were not a slave holder. You were not a slave owner.
As far as I know, no. My story's like yours. We settled from Germany out in western Pennsylvania. My heritage was actually they used to hunt wolves in Pennsylvania.
Yeah. So
wolves back in the.
So your family, your ancestors, did not benefit from the slaveholding Southern economy in our country.
No, you know what? That's the thing. I think the United States benefited from it, and that includes the blacks that live here today and the whites that live here today. Now you look at Africa. I'm not insulting Africa or nothing like that, but I mean, let's face it. Where do you want to live at? If you have your choice of anywhere in the world to live at, where are you going to live at?
Yeah. Well,
Mike, be honest. Can we just be real a little bit? You know what I mean? Like I understand it was wrong, and we've all been persecuted and wronged, and I just think that, me as a white guy, I'm not a racist myself. I just get sick of being labeled as privileged. I have everything, and I'm the problem of the world, and I'm a pig. That's all I hear in the news nowadays. And I'll let you speak. Thanks for taking my call.
Well, Mike from Harrisburg, thanks for calling, and I'm sure you're not racist, but the Democratic presidential candidates will make you atone for the racism of Americans who lived here 150 to 250 to 300 years ago. So open up your checkbook and get ready to write a check. We have Mike from Carlisle. You're on the Mark Scaringi Show. Do you support the reparations bill?
Well, let me give you two points to make. Please.
Let's hear them. Yep.
First of all, people need to get into their heads that it's history. Lots of bad things happen to a lot of people. We need to let it go. And I don't know if you saw, but now the geniuses at Dickinson College now feel that they need to take names off. Well, they haven't said they will, but they will. They're going to look at the buildings. If anybody owned a slave, they're probably going to rip his name off of a building, even though he may have helped build the college, etc. And the second part is, okay, then if we're going to pay everybody back for everything bad, I want to know what the formulary is for those of Jewish heritage to collect from the country of Germany.
Yeah, well, there is a reparations program in place for descendants of the Holocaust, and there's even a legal fund in which Jewish descendants of individuals who suffered in the Holocaust are receiving some sort of compensation. So that's kind of the a template, I think, that those who support the reparations program in this country will probably look to.
Do you know what kind of a value that really is, though? We have to remember, too, when I'm talking about history, look what happened after World War I. One of the reasons that people like Hitler were excited was Germany was bent over the barrel afterwards. Everybody took advantage and drove them into the ground.
Yeah, the legal fund that I'm referring to is the Nazi confiscation of Jewish wealth, bank accounts, jewelry, artwork, land, personal property, etc. And so the fund was created to try to reimburse the descendants of those Jewish families who had their property confiscated by the Nazi government. But Mike from Carlisle, thanks for calling. Appreciate that. We'll take another call. Mike from Camp Hill, you've got about 1 minute. Do you support the reparations program?
Mark, love the show. Thanks for taking my call. Let me preface my comment with, I do not speak for the total loyal fraternal order of Mikes in Pennsylvania.
I had 3 in a row.
But I think it's simple to me that the backbone of the Democratic Party is to redistribute wealth, and this is exactly what their goal is.
Yeah, this would be a mass redistribution of wealth. No question about that.
Yeah, finally, the Democratic Party has taken their mask off, so to speak, and they are socialists, and they have been for the past 60 years.
Well, this has been historically an extremist view, this reparations bill, but now it's being embraced by major Democratic presidential candidates. So it is now going to be in the mainstream of the Democratic Party, so we're going to be hearing a lot more about it. Mike from Camp Hill, thanks for calling. I've got to go to a commercial break. You're listening to the Mark Scaringi Show. Stay tuned. We'll be back right after this.
Now back to the Mark Scaringi Show on News Radio WHP 580.
And welcome back to the Mark Scaringi Show, your place on the dial for constitutional conservatism. We talk here about the important political and legal issues of the day. We're talking about the Democratic presidential candidates who are positioning themselves, it looks to be, as far to the left as possible to resonate well with the most vocal part of the Democratic primary voters, typically those on the left who drive the numbers to the polls. The Democratic presidential candidates visited the Holy Reverend Al Sharpton in New York at his annual National Action Network conference, where he was having his ring kissed repeatedly by Beto O'Rourke, a rather oddly named Hispanic man, being that he's not. He's Irish. And U.S. Senator Kamala Harris from California, who some on the left accuse her of not being black enough, so she has some issues there. Representative Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts was there. She's an extremely white person, yet she claims to be a descendant of Cherokee Indians. All of these individuals, and then, of course, the exceedingly white, I don't think you can get any whiter than Bernie Sanders, our lovable socialist senator from Vermont. He was there at the conference, at Reverend Sharpton's conference, and he has now flipped his position, and perhaps because he did so poorly among black Democrats in the recent 2016 Democratic presidential primaries, he has now flipped his position, and he is now in favor of a reparations bill sponsored by Representative Sheila Jackson Lee, a Democratic congresswoman from Texas who also happens to be black. And I had pointed out, I wonder if there is a conflict of interest for a Democratic politician to propose and vote in favor of a reparations bill that will provide financial compensation to black Americans. I assume if they can prove they are descendants of African slaves in America, because we've had huge, massive amounts of immigration starting in the 1880s and 1890s, several decades after slavery was abolished in America. We have millions of blacks from Africa, from the Caribbean nations who immigrated to the U.S. after slavery was abolished. Will they qualify for the reparations, even though they were not slaves and were not descendants of slaves? So that's going to be kind of a sticky wicket for Democrats in our government to figure out who gets the money, who gets the reparation. Will you have to fill out an application and prove that you are black and that you are a descendant of African slaves? Now, what about the thousands of American blacks who owned slaves? Carter G. Woodson, an African-American historian, found that in 1830, a total of nearly 4,000 free blacks in the U.S. owned slaves. Over about 13,000 Africans were enslaved by around 4,000 former Africans who were black Americans, and there are estimates that number quadrupled by the start of the Civil War. So you might have 20-some thousand black Americans who owned slaves in America. Now, what if you are a black American in Harrisburg today and you are the descendant of a black slave holder? Do you still qualify for the reparations? I guess that's a question for the Holy Reverend Al Sharpton and others to answer as they go through their plan for reparations. And, I wonder, has the U.S. government, have the American people, have we done enough already to atone for our original sin of having slavery in America? We fought a war against the southern states in which about 360,000 overwhelmingly white soldiers from Pennsylvania, New York, Vermont, Maine, Massachusetts, from the northern states, they were killed. They died in the Civil War. One of the war aims was to free the slaves, and that happened. We did. More Americans, overwhelmingly white, died in the Civil War than in any other war in the history of our country. And remember, haven't we already made Southern slave holders and just Southern Americans during the Civil War and immediately after the Civil War, remembering only a very small percentage of Southern people were slaveholders? The overwhelming majority of white Southerners were not slaveholders. But haven't we already made them pay? Haven't they already atoned for their sin? The United States Army devastated much of the southern states. Remember the burning of the Shenandoah Valley, the burning of Atlanta, Sherman's march to the sea. Whole swaths of the South were destroyed by the United States Army, punished, made to atone for the sin of seceding and the sin of practicing slavery. Northern taxpayers paid over $2 billion during the Civil War in direct outlays from the U.S. Treasury to support the Northern war effort. That's billions of dollars raised from white Northern taxpayers to fight the Civil War, to subdue the South and free the slaves. Are those billions not enough? Are the 360,000 white Northern soldiers, their deaths fighting for the freedom of slaves, is that not enough? Didn't America pay? Hasn't America paid already with vast amounts of its own blood and treasure for the original sin of slavery. And so should the descendants of white Northern soldiers who died in the Civil War, should they be exempt from paying the reparations tax? So if you're a white American today, maybe you're sitting at your coffee table in Harrisburg and you're contemplating this new Democratic plan to impose essentially a reparations system that's going to be paid for by U.S. taxpayers. Can you fill out an exemption form if you can prove that you're the descendant of a U.S. soldier who went to Virginia or Alabama or Florida or North Carolina and fought to free the slaves? Can you be exempt from having to pay the reparations tax because your descendants have already atoned for the sin of slavery, haven't they? What about the African chieftains and tribal leaders of the 18th century who were complicit in the African slave trade to America? White Americans could not have obtained one African slave without the assistance of the African chieftains and tribal leaders in West Africa. The African slave trade, the so-called Middle Passage, was closed down by white Americans who were framers of our United States Constitution, who put in the Constitution that the Congress had the ability to shut down the slave trade, and the Congress did as soon as it had the opportunity. As soon as it was permitted by the Constitution, white congressmen in the United States shut down the slave trade. So was that a form of atonement? What if we can prove we were descendants of the congressmen who voted to end the slave trade? Do we get credit against the reparations tax? I'd like to know. But keep in mind, for another 100 years, nearly another 100 years, African chieftains and tribal leaders in West Africa continue to provide slaves, mostly to South America, where under the Spanish colonial system, slavery continued. The BBC reports that by the end of the 18th century, 70,000 Africans a year were captured by African slavers and chieftains and taken against their will and sent to America. So we have at least 12 million Africans who were forcibly removed from the continent of Africa by their African tribal leaders. I wonder if we can look to those the descendants of the wealthy African tribal leaders and chieftains and kings and queens of West Africa who became vastly wealthy off the Atlantic slave trade. Can we look to them for reparations? They're rich. They got rich off slavery, off selling the men and women of rival tribes, selling them to slavers who sent them over to the U.S. So maybe they should be made to pay some reparations. So since we're getting into the reparations game, perhaps that's where we should look. And what about the French and the British and the Americans who ended the international slave trade in the 19th century? Do they get any credit for the actions that they took? We will have to wait and see what happens to the reparations bill that Representative Sheila Jackson Lee of Texas has proposed, and all of the major Democratic presidential candidates have gotten strongly on board in support of. Take a look at the Reverend Al Sharpton's National Action Network Conference. You can Google it, and you can see your favorite Democratic presidential candidates up there at the altar kissing the ring of the new kingmaker of the Democratic Party, Reverend Sharpton, and pledging to support this reparations bill. So as I was talking to about this with some of the callers, this is going to be an issue. And I'll just say one last thing about it. I think, of course, and I'm being ironic and a little tongue-in-cheek throughout this broadcast, but I think it's just about the worst idea I've ever heard. I think that a reparations bill where U.S. taxpayers are paying money to black Americans who are the descendants of slaves is only going to exacerbate racial strife and division in America. It's going to make it much worse than it is now if we start race baiting and race taxing in this manner. Well, that's about all the time we have today for the Mark Scaringi Show. Tune in next Saturday at 1 p.m., same time, same place, to get the conservative perspective on the big political and legal issues of the day.